Hey everyone, welcome to Home Group Bible Study video. I was asked a few weeks ago if I'd like to sit in and take Pastor Don's place in doing this study for a week, and I thought, man, that would be fun to do, not thinking about the awkwardness of speaking to yourself in a video, all those things that he and others have done over the last year or so. So anyways, I'm kind of getting used to all that. Bear with me. I also didn't think about too much what the chapters were. And then I started reading the chapters, and I thought, oh, this is going to be fun. And started realizing that I need to check out some commentaries on the chapters to really give some good analysis and thoughts to it. And one of the first persons that I actually listened to a couple messages by a preacher by the name of J. Vernon McGee. When I was a kid, my dad would come home for lunch, and at lunchtime at the local radio station would play J. Vernon McGee. And so he was a Bible teacher, pastor from my childhood. And so I've always thought pretty highly of him. And I thought, well, J. Vernon will have something good to say. And one of the very first things that he said was, he said, I am unworthy to talk about Zechariah chapters 9 through 14. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm in trouble. And then as I was continuing to read, I saw a quote from the great Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther, the reformer. And he had written a commentary on, he actually wrote two commentaries on Zechariah, the book of Zechariah. The first one ended with chapter 13. He didn't even finish his commentary on chapter 13. And then he decided to take it up again years later and got to chapter 14. And in chapter 14, his commentary just says, "Here in this chapter, I give up. For I'm not sure what the prophet is talking about." And so this week we have in front of us a little bit of a challenging few chapters to read, but they're good. They actually are pivotal. They talk about some pivotal moments in history that God prophesied about. Well, actually, the book of Zechariah, it talks about pivotal moments in history that Zechariah prophesied about. But in specifically 12 through 14 are all about future to come events. So the book of Zechariah is split up. Chapters 1 through 8 were written during the construction of the temple. Chapters 9 through 14 were written after the temple was constructed. And so there's a little bit of different tenor or tone in those chapters. 1 through 8 talks a lot about repentance and returning, and is more warnings to the children of Israel about staying on the straight and narrow path. It does talk about the coming Messiah to some extent, but when we get into chapters 9 through 14, what you'll see is it becomes almost exclusively about the Messiah. So our focus this week, though, is on chapters 12 through 14. But what precedes that is chapters 9 through 11, if you can follow the math there. 9 through 11 talk a lot about Christ coming for the first time. And Zechariah is the one book that's second in the Old Testament as far as the number of messianic prophecies. And so we see in Zechariah, if you just read through the entire book, you see some very specific prophecies that Zechariah made, that God gave to Zechariah, that have already come true. And so that gives us hope. It makes us believe that we can rely on the rest of the prophecies that haven't come about yet. So in the early parts of Zechariah, you can see that Zechariah describes the Messiah as coming from the house of David, or a branch will sprout from the Davidic line. We also see in chapter 6 that he describes the lowly king riding on a donkey. And then in chapter 11, he talks about the Messiah being betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. And then early in chapter 12, he talks about the pierced or crucified Christ. And then in 13, he talks about the Messiah actually being God, and not just another guy, but God. So that's a little background on Zechariah. A couple things to keep in mind, just as far as timing of the book. Zechariah is what they would call a pre-exilic or a post-exilic book. So in other words, it happened after the exile. And the Jews had returned. They're rebuilding the temple, as I'd mentioned. He's actually a contemporary of the prophet Haggai, so they were walking around Israel at the same time, both of them receiving words from God, and they're proclaiming those to the children of Israel at the same time. Haggai has a tendency to be a little more doom and gloom, and in Zechariah, actually, when you read these 3 chapters, you might think, oh, that doesn't sound so great. But it really is, if you're an Israeli or a children of Israel, they would probably look at these as good things. And we'll get into a little bit about what all that means as we go along. So Zechariah personally he was a Levite, and so he was a priest in addition to being a prophet. Makes him a little bit unique in that sense. So as I'd mentioned, the book is considered one of the more difficult prophetic books to kind of work through, and some of that has to do with the fact that he will use some symbology that can be difficult to understand. And I think in some cases, these prophets are given these words to say from God, and they're talking about events that are going to happen in the future, things that they can't necessarily imagine or conceive. Like I remember my grandmother talking with her, and she grew up in a time where people didn't even have telephones necessarily. It wasn't that common. And when she was older and I'd go visit her in the nursing home, I'd show her pictures of my kids on my cell phone. I would call her sons and daughters from my cell phone. I carried the phone with me. And so for her as a child to envision somebody being able to walk around with a device that you could talk to anybody in the world, that you could see pictures and things like that on, it would have been hard for her to even imagine that, let alone that it would fit in the palm of your hand. And so imagine what it was like for these prophets to look centuries into the future, even thousands of years into the future, and to be told things from God, and then have to try to explain them in terms that the people of their time would understand. And so Zechariah is considered one of the more difficult prophetic books to follow along. It also has a little bit of controversy in that it describes what we would call the millennium, Christ millennial reign, and some people don't follow that. They don't adhere to that, and so this is a doctrine that can have a little bit of controversy associated with it. We choose to interpret Zechariah literally, and that's the way that we really approach Bible teaching. Is that unless there's reason, some very sound reason to interpret something as symbolic, we will choose to read it as a literal interpretation. And so when we read through Zechariah, these last 3 chapters, we see Christ returning and reigning on earth when what is termed as his millennial reign, or 1,000-year reign. So a quick outline, and this is outlined from J. Vernon McGee, as I'd mentioned. If you want the link to probably the most comprehensive outlines and material that I found, I'll post that along with this, or ask Lisa to post that website. But I just thought I'd go through this outline just to help you as you go through and study it. And maybe if you have this ahead of time before you start reading, or maybe you've read it and you're just confused, maybe this will help you have a better understanding of what's happening. So we start in chapter 12, and chapter 12 is broken into 3 different sections. Verses 1 through 3, what we see is Israel, or Jerusalem, being a constant irritant to all nations. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting thing, because up until 1948, Jerusalem was not a country. It was a protectorate of various empires, including the British and the Ottomans, and before them the Mamelukes, and so they weren't a nation. And now, since 1948, Israel has been a nation, and quite honestly, they're an irritant to their neighbors, but have they become an irritant to all the nations in the world? So that's the first thing that we see is in Zechariah 12, 1 through 3, that Israel, or Jerusalem, is an irritant to all the nations. In 4 through 9, Jerusalem is delivered from a final siege. So the people of the world rise up against Israel, and the Lord comes personally. So Jesus Christ returns. And in that, at the end of that chapter, we see this prophecy of Jesus' pierced hands. And it's because of his pierced hands that the Israelis recognize and understand that, or I should say the Jews recognize that this is truly the Messiah that they rejected. And then it moves into chapter 13. It says in chapter 13, the remnant will return. And so what we see is Christ redeeming, or this group of Jews. Chapter 13, continuing in 2 through 5, the false prophet and his followers are taken. And this is the end of this false religion that rises up in the end times. And in the rest of the chapter, we see that Christ has a group of people that don't desert him, as they did with his first coming to earth, and all of his disciples rejected him, left him alone to die on the cross. This time there's a remnant of people that stay with him. And that's described at the very end of chapter 13. Now, chapter 14 describes this battle or conflict that's going to happen at the end time. You may have heard of it. It's, in other terms, it's not described this way in Zechariah 14, but in other parts of the Bible, we find out that this is a battle that happens in Armageddon, which is a valley in the kind of north of Jerusalem that just kind of extends from the Jordan River all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And Christ returns. Now, there's some interesting things that happen because you'll see that when Christ returns, he actually returns to the Mount of Olives, which is where he ascended from. So he ascended to heaven from the Mount of Olives. Now he returns and physically puts his feet back on the Mount of Olives. And what happens at that time is there's a great change in the topography of the land. And the Mount of Olives splits in half. And it sounds to me, as I read through there, that this creates a large valley that goes from the Mount of Olives all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And this makes Jerusalem a seaport city by doing this. And Jesus Christ reigns over the earth from Jerusalem. And we see that in verses 10 and 11. And at the end of the chapter, what we see is that both Jews and Gentiles now go to Jerusalem to celebrate and worship once again. And Christ rules from Jerusalem for that period of time. So that's just a quick outline. I hope that's helpful to you. Again, I'll put this link to this website so you can kind of refer to it, and then maybe it'll help you understand some of these things better. I think in all of these things, even when we're talking about prophecy, there's always opportunities, and I hope that you'll take time to reflect on some of these things. When I look at that, and I think about 4 different things that stood out to me that are applicable to me today. The first thing is you'll see this redundant use of this term, on that day, on that day, on that day. I think it's 7 or 8 times in those 3 chapters that you see that phrase. And when I read that, I'm reminded that day's coming. It's not here yet. God is still being patient, but he will at some point not allow sin to continue, and the end is coming. And I'm not ready to go walk around on a street corner with a placard that says the end is coming, but we have to keep that in mind, and we need to be preparing ourselves, preparing our family and our children for that, and also helping our friends and co-workers, people that we know, people we come in contact, to be ready for the end. And I'm not talking about making sure that they have a 6 month supply of food, although that's not a bad thing if that's what you choose to do. But spiritually, we need to be ready. And so people need to understand the signs of the times. They also just need to understand that Jesus Christ loves them. And we need to share that with them whenever we can, however we can. The other thing I recognize specifically for chapter 14, 12 and 13, it describes this the final times and the people that oppose Christ and what they'll suffer and how he chooses to battle with them in that time. And it reminds me that opposing God has horrible consequences. Horrible consequences. And we need to be on God's side. And that's what those verses. Life is much better here on earth when we are on God's side. Verse 1 of chapter 13, I look at God's faithfulness to his people, regardless of how they treat him. So check out verse 13 and think about that, and just take a minute to praise God for who he is and how faithful he is to us, how faithful he's been to his chosen people, the Israelites, and ask him to encourage us to be faithful to others the way that he has been to us. And then the final thing is at the very end of chapter 14, I'm encouraged because what we see there is God making common things holy. He uses things that are not beautiful. They're very practical. They're common, and he uses them for special purposes. And that's encouraging to me because I'm not anything special. I'm not very good at doing videos, as you can tell. But God can use common things, and he will, and he has. So that's it for me for today in this chapter. I hope this is helpful to you guys. Make sure that you don't just read these chapters and walk around your house contemplating them. Reach out and talk to somebody else about them. Have some good conversations and enjoy learning from each other what God's taught. God bless you as you read through these. Bye now.